Katie Morgan pressed her face against the small window of the transport shuttle and watched the massive space station grow larger ahead of them. Kepler Station looked like a giant metal flower floating in the darkness of space, with dozens of arms reaching out in all directions. Below the station, the planet Terminus Prime spun slowly, its surface covered in swirling storms and strange purple clouds that seemed to glow with their own light. The shuttle pilot, a short alien with blue skin and 4 arms, glanced back at her nervously. He had been quiet for most of the journey, only speaking when absolutely necessary. Katie knew why. She was human, and humans came from places that other species called Deathworlds, places so dangerous that most aliens needed special suits and medical support just to visit them. The pilot probably thought she might suddenly go crazy and attack someone. Katie sighed and turned away from the window. She was 17 years old, with brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail and green eyes that seemed to notice everything around her. She wore plain clothes, a gray shirt and dark pants, nothing fancy or threatening. But she knew that to the aliens on this station, she would always be the dangerous one, the savage from a world that tried to kill everything that lived on it. Her father, Dr. Carl Morgan, sat across from her reading reports on his tablet. He was a xenobiologist, someone who studied alien life forms, and he had been invited to Kepler Station to research the extreme creatures that lived on Terminus Prime. The planet was so hostile that even the toughest alien species could only study it from orbit, but somehow life had found a way to survive down there. Her father wanted to understand how the shuttle docked with a soft thump that Katie barely felt. The pilot announced their arrival in broken Standard Galactic, the common language that most species use to communicate with each other. Katie spoke it fluently, along with several alien languages that her father had taught her over the years. Growing up as the child of a xenobiologist meant moving around a lot and meeting all kinds of strange beings. They walked through the docking tube and into the station proper. Katie immediately noticed how clean and bright everything was. The corridors were wide and well lit, with information displays floating in the air showing directions to different sections. The gravity felt normal, almost exactly like Earth gravity, which meant the station was designed to accommodate many different species, but what really caught her attention were the other beings walking through the corridors. She saw tall, thin creatures that looked like they were made of living crystal, their bodies catching and reflecting the station lights in beautiful patterns. These were Zephyrians, one of the more advanced species in the galactic community. They moved with elegant grace, their crystalline limbs making soft musical sounds as they walked. There were also insect-like beings with multiple arms and compound eyes that glittered like jewels. The Vorthak were known for their incredible mathematical abilities and their hive-like social structure. They chittered to each other in their clicking language as they hurried past, carrying various scientific instruments. The third major group she saw were the Kaleri, amphibious beings with smooth, wet-looking skin that changed colors based on their emotions. They had large eyes and webbed fingers, and they moved with fluid motions that reminded Katie of swimmers. Most of them showed colors of curiosity and mild concern when they noticed her and her father, a Kaleri in official station uniform, approached them. His skin was currently a professional blue-green color, and he spoke in careful, precise galactic standard. Dr. Morgan, welcome to Kepler Station. I am Administrator Quetelin. We are pleased to have such a renowned xenobiologist join our research team. Her father shook hands with the administrator, though Katie noticed that Quetelin seemed surprised by the firm grip. Thank you for having us. This is my daughter Katie. She'll be participating in the youth education program while I conduct my research. Quetelin's skin shifted to a slightly more orange tint, which Katie recognized as uncertainty or mild worry. Of course. We have prepared quarters for both of you in the residential section. The young beings in our education program are quite excited to meet a human, though I must admit, some are also somewhat nervous. Katie had expected this. Everywhere her father's work took them, she encountered the same mixture of fascination and fear. Humans had a reputation in the galactic community as being tough, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. Stories about human history, their wars and survival instincts, had spread throughout known space. Most aliens couldn't understand how any species could evolve on a world where nearly everything was trying to kill them. They followed Quidlin through the station's main corridors, passing laboratories, common areas, and what looked like recreational facilities. Katie noticed that many of the aliens they passed stopped their conversations to stare at her. Some quickly looked away when she made eye contact, while others watched her with obvious curiosity. "The education wing is located in Section 7, Quidlin explained as they walked. Young beings from various species study together to learn about different cultures and scientific disciplines. It promotes understanding and cooperation among the younger generation." Katie nodded politely, though she wondered how much cooperation she would actually find. In her experience, young aliens were often more fearful of humans than adults, who had at least some scientific understanding of human biology and psychology. They reached the residential quarters, which were surprisingly spacious. Each family had their own suite with multiple rooms, designed to accommodate the needs of different species. The Morgan family quarters had been specially modified with Earth-normal atmosphere, temperature, and humidity levels. "Your father's laboratory access will be activated tomorrow morning," Quidlin told them. "Katie, your education schedule will begin the day after. This will give you both time to adjust to station life and recover from your journey." After the administrator left, Katie explored their new temporary home. The walls were a soft gray color, and the furniture was simple but comfortable. Large windows showed views of both the station's other sections and the planet below. She could see Terminus Prime rotating slowly, its violent storms, creating swirling patterns in the atmosphere that were actually quite beautiful from a safe distance. Her father came up beside her at the window. "What do you think of our new home?" Katie watched a group of crystalline Zephyrians walk past in the corridor outside. They moved in perfect formation, their bodies creating a light show of reflected illumination. "It's very organized," she said. "Very safe and controlled. Not like the frontier stations we usually end up on." "That's because this is a major research facility," her father explained. "Some of the galaxy's best scientists work here. You'll be learning alongside the children of brilliant minds from dozens of different worlds." Katie smiled, though she felt a familiar knot of worry in her stomach. Smart alien children were often the worst when it came to prejudice against humans. They had been taught about human history and capabilities in their advanced education programs, and they thought they understood what humans were like based on data and statistics. They didn't understand that not every human was a warrior or a killer, that some of them just wanted to study and learn like everyone else. But Katie had learned long ago that the best way to handle prejudice was simply to ignore it and focus on her own goals. She would attend the classes, learn everything she could about the incredible variety of life in the galaxy, and maybe make a few friends along the way. And if some of the other students decided to cause trouble, well, she would deal with that problem when it came up. Katie's first day in the education wing started early with a general orientation session. She walked through corridors that hummed with quiet efficiency, following the floating directional signs to Classroom Sector 7. Other young aliens moved through the halls in small groups, their conversations stopping whenever they noticed her presence. The orientation room was large and circular, with seating designed to accommodate different body types and species requirements. Katie chose a seat near the back, as was her habit. She preferred to observe before engaging, a survival instinct that served her well in new environments. As other students filed in, she got her first close look at her new classmates. The Zephyrians moved in a tight group, their crystalline bodies creating small light shows as they communicated through color changes in their transparent skin. There were about 6 of them, all roughly her age based on their size and the way they carried themselves. The Vortex student scuttled in next, their multiple legs clicking against the floor in rhythmic patterns. Katie had learned that these clicking sounds were actually a form of secondary communication, expressing emotions and social status within their group structure. The 3 Vortex students seemed nervous, their compound eyes darting around the room constantly. 4 Kalari students entered together, their skin colors shifting through various shades of blue and green. Katie recognized these as colors of excitement and curiosity in their species. Unlike the others, they seemed genuinely interested in meeting new beings. Rather than worried about potential threats, the instructor was an elderly Zephyrian whose crystal structure had developed beautiful fractal patterns with age. She introduced herself as Professor Veltara and began explaining the station's educational philosophy of cooperative learning between species. Katie listened politely while noting how the other students kept glancing in her direction. During the break between sessions, the whispering began. Katie pretended to read her orientation materials while listening to the conversations around her. Her enhanced hearing, a typical human adaptation that most aliens didn't know about, allowed her to pick up words and phrases from across the room. "That's the human girl," one of the Zephyrians said in their musical language. "I heard humans eat the flesh of other species. My parent told me they destroyed their own planet's environment just for profit," another replied. "They have no respect for life," a Vorthic student clicked nervously. "The data files say they've fought wars for thousands of years. Violence is programmed into their genetic structure." Katie sighed quietly and turned a page in her materials. She had heard variations of these comments countless times before. Most aliens learned about humans through historical records and scientific studies that focused on humanity's more aggressive periods. They rarely heard about human art, philosophy, or the millions of humans who lived peaceful lives dedicated to learning and discovery. The first real class was xenobiology, ironically, the subject her father specialized in. The instructor, a Kalari named Professor Ripton, seemed genuinely pleased to have a human student in his class. "Today we'll discuss adaptation strategies in extreme environments," he announced. "Perhaps our human student can provide some insights." Given her species' unique evolutionary background, Katie felt every eye in the room focus on her. She had been hoping to avoid attention for at least the first week, but apparently that wasn't going to happen. "Human adaptations are mostly related to persistence and problem solving," she said simply. "We develop tools and cooperation to overcome environmental challenges rather than biological specializations." One of the Zephyrian students, a tall individual with particularly sharp crystal formations, raised his hand. "But didn't humans also develop enhanced aggression and territorial instincts to survive on their Deathworld?" Katie recognized the challenge in the question. The student wasn't asking for information. He was trying to get her to admit that humans were naturally violent. "Humans develop strong protective instincts," she replied carefully. "But we also developed strong cooperative instincts. Most human societies value peace and stability." The Zephyrian's crystal structure brightened with what Katie recognized as satisfaction. He had gotten her to respond defensively, which probably confirmed his preconceptions about human nature. She made a mental note to avoid engaging with him in future discussions. After class, the real problem started. As Katie gathered her materials, the group of Zephyrians surrounded her desk. The tall one, who had asked the challenging question, positioned himself directly in front of her path to the door. "I'm SeatHFY," he said with what passed for a smile among his species. "I find human biology quite fascinating from a scientific perspective. Tell me, is it true that humans can dislocate their own joints to escape from restraints?" Katie looked up at him calmly. "Some can. It's not a common ability." She tried to step around him, but he moved to block her path again. "How interesting," SeatHFY continued. "And the stories about humans being able to ignore severe injuries through chemical reactions in their brains, is that accurate?" "Adrenaline can temporarily suppress pain responses," Katie replied. "But humans aren't immune to injury." She made another attempt to leave, but now 2 other Zephyrians had positioned themselves to block the other exits. "Of course not," SeatHFY said. "You're still biological beings, despite your reputation for being unusually durable. I'm sure even a human would be vulnerable to the right kind of pressure applied to the correct nerve clusters." Katie finally understood what was happening. This wasn't scientific curiosity. It was a threat. Zixtela was telling her that he knew ways to hurt her and that he wasn't intimidated by her species' reputation for toughness. The other Zephyrians were backing him up, creating a subtle but clear message about the social hierarchy they expected her to accept. Instead of responding to the threat, Katie simply sat back down and pulled out her tablet. If you're interested in human biology, there are several good research databases available through the station's library system, she said without looking up. I have studying to do. The casual dismissal clearly frustrated Zixtela. His crystal structure flared brighter, and the musical tones his body produced shifted to a more aggressive frequency. I was attempting to have a civilized conversation, he said. On this station, we value intellectual discourse between species, Katie continued reading her tablet. The professor assigned 3 chapters for tomorrow's class. I want to finish them before dinner. The other students in the room had noticed the confrontation and were watching with obvious interest. Some of the Kaleri students seemed concerned, their skin showing worried orange patterns. The Vortex students had moved closer, their clicking communication increasing in frequency as they discussed the situation among themselves. Zixtela's friends exchanged glances before he finally stepped aside. Of course, he said with exaggerated politeness. Academic dedication is admirable. We'll have many opportunities to continue our discussions in future classes. As Katie left the classroom, she could hear the Zephyrians talking among themselves in their musical language. She caught enough words to understand that they viewed her behavior as either arrogance or cowardice, and they were planning to test her further to determine which it was. Over the following days, the pattern continued. Zixtela and his group would find ways to interact with Katie that seemed innocent to any casual observer, but carried clear undertones of intimidation. They would ask her pointed questions about human violence, make comments about the primitive nature of Deathworld species, or position themselves to block her movements in subtle ways. Katie's response was always the same, complete indifference. She focused on her studies, participated in class discussions when called upon, and otherwise acted as if the Zephyrians didn't exist. This approach had worked for her in the past, but she could see that it was having the opposite effect on Zixtela. Each time she ignored his provocations, his frustration grew more obvious. The other students began to take notice of the ongoing tension. The Kaleri students, particularly one named Splishka, started making friendly overtures to Katie. They would sit near her during lectures and invite her to join their study groups. The Vortex students remained neutral, but watched the developing situation with obvious interest. Katie appreciated the Kaleri students' friendliness, but she also knew that accepting their support would escalate the conflict with Zixtela. He would view any alliance she formed as a challenge to his attempt to establish dominance over her. For now, she preferred to handle the situation alone, hoping that his interest would eventually fade if she continued to avoid giving him the reactions he was looking for. But as the days passed, Katie began to suspect that Zixtela wasn't going to give up easily. His behavior was becoming more persistent and more openly aggressive. Sooner or later, she would need to address the situation directly, and she hoped she could find a way to do it without confirming every negative stereotype the other students had about human nature. 2 weeks into her time at Kepler Station, Katie had settled into a routine that allowed her to avoid most direct confrontations while still excelling in her studies. She woke early, attended classes, spent time in the library researching topics that interested her, and returned to her quarters before the common areas became too crowded with social activities. Her strategy of complete indifference toward Zixtela's group was becoming more difficult to maintain. What had started as subtle intimidation was escalating into more obvious harassment. During yesterday's stellar cartography class, one of Zixtela's friends had deliberately knocked her star charts to the floor while walking past her desk. When she bent to pick them up, another Zephyrian had stepped on the papers, leaving crystalline scratches across her carefully drawn diagrams. Katie had simply gathered the damaged papers, returned to her seat, and continued taking notes as if nothing had happened. But she noticed that Professor Veltara had observed the incident. and the elderly Zephyrian's expression had shown clear disapproval. Unfortunately, the professor's attention was focused on the Zephyrian students' behavior rather than the situation that had caused it. The morning's first class was practical xenobiology in Laboratory Complex C. Katie enjoyed the hands-on work, examining specimens from various worlds and learning about the incredible diversity of life that existed throughout the galaxy. Today, they would be studying symbiotic organisms from the Kaleri homeworld, creatures that had evolved to work together in ways that benefited both species. She arrived at the laboratory early and chose a workstation near the back corner, where she could focus on her work without distraction. The lab was equipped with advanced microscopes, analysis equipment, and containment fields for studying potentially dangerous specimens safely. Other students began filtering into the lab, chatting among themselves about the assignment. Katie noticed that Splishke, the friendly Kaleri student, had chosen a workstation nearby. His skin was showing the bright blue-green colors that indicated excitement and curiosity about the upcoming lesson. "Good morning, Katie," Splishke said in his fluid voice. "I heard these symbiotic pairs are fascinating. Some of them have been working together for so many generations that they can barely survive separately anymore." Katie smiled at the Kaleri student. Over the past 2 weeks, Splishke had been consistently kind to her, never showing the fear or suspicion that characterized most other students' interactions with her. "That's an interesting evolutionary strategy," she replied. "Cooperation, leading to interdependence rather than competition." "Yes, exactly." Splishke's colors shifted to show pleasure at her understanding. "My parent is a marine biologist on our homeworld, and they study these relationships extensively. Perhaps we could work together on today's analysis?" Before Katie could respond, SeatHFY's voice cut through their conversation. "How touching," the Zephyrian said as he approached their workstations. "The amphibian wants to partner with the Deathworld savage. I suppose that makes sense, given that both of your species evolved from primitive aquatic ancestors." Splishke's skin colors immediately shifted to orange and red, showing anger and offense. "Katie is an excellent student," he said firmly. "Her insights in class have been more valuable than most of the comments I've heard from others." SeatHFY's crystal structure brightened with amusement. "Oh, I'm sure she has many insights about survival and violence. But this is a science laboratory, not a combat training facility. We're here to study delicate biological relationships, not learn about the brutal methods Deathworld species use to dominate their environments." Katie continued setting up her microscope and preparing her specimen slides. She had learned that the best way to handle SeatHFY's provocations was to act as if he wasn't even present. Responding to his comments only encouraged him to continue, and she refused to give him that satisfaction. "The human ignores you because she knows you speak the truth," one of SeatHFY's friends added. "Deathworld species have no understanding of subtle scientific work. They only know how to break things and fight." Splishke's colors deepened to dark red. "That's completely wrong. Katie has demonstrated more knowledge about biological systems than any of us. Just yesterday she explained protein folding mechanisms that I didn't understand until she showed me the molecular diagrams." Katie felt a warmth of gratitude toward the Kaleri student for defending her, but she also recognized that his support was making the situation worse. SeatHFY viewed any alliance she formed as a challenge to his attempts to isolate her socially. Now Splishke was becoming a target as well. The laboratory instructor, Professor Ripton, called for attention and began explaining the day's assignment. The students would work in pairs to examine symbiotic organisms and document how the two species had adapted to support each other's survival. Katie hoped this would end the confrontation, but SeatHFY had other plans. As Professor Ripton distributed specimen containers, SeatHFY positioned himself directly behind Katie's workstation. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding human adaptations," he said in a voice loud enough for nearby students to hear. "You claim that humans developed cooperation and problem-solving abilities, but the historical records tell a different story." Katie focused on adjusting her microscope settings, trying to ignore the crystalline alien's presence behind her. She could feel his sharp-edged form looming over her shoulder as he continued speaking. The data shows that humans fought constant wars throughout their history, SciFi continued. They developed increasingly sophisticated methods of killing their own species. They destroyed entire ecosystems for short-term resource gains. They even created weapons capable of sterilizing entire planets. Several other students had stopped their work to listen. Katie noticed that some of the Vorthok students were clicking among themselves, probably discussing whether SciFi's statements were accurate. The Kaleri students showed various shades of concern and confusion. And yet here you sit, SciFi leaned closer, his voice dropping to a more personal tone, pretending to be just another peaceful student interested in scientific cooperation. Do you really expect us to believe that millions of years of violent evolution can be suppressed so easily? Katie carefully placed a specimen slide under her microscope and began making detailed observations. The symbiotic organisms were beautiful. Two completely different life forms that had learned to work together so effectively that they functioned as a single entity. She made notes about their cellular structure and the way they shared nutrients and chemical signals. I find your silence interesting, SciFi continued. Is it because you know I'm correct about your species' nature? Or are you planning some kind of violent response and trying to control your primitive impulses? Splishka's colors flared to bright red. Leave her alone, SciFi. She's trying to complete her assignment, just like the rest of us. The amphibian defends his new friend, another Zephyrian laughed. How predictable. Weak species always band together when they feel threatened by their superiors. Katie finished her initial observations and moved to the next phase of the analysis. She needed to document how the two organisms communicated with each other and coordinated their biological functions. It required careful attention to detail and precise measurements of chemical concentrations. SciFi moved even closer, his crystalline form now directly beside her workstation. You know what I think? He said, his voice taking on a more menacing tone. I think you're afraid. For all the stories about human toughness and survival instincts, you're just another weak creature trying to hide among civilized beings. Katie recorded her measurements and began preparing slides for the next stage of analysis. The symbiotic relationship she was studying had taken millions of years to develop, with each species gradually adapting to support the other's needs. It was a perfect example of how cooperation could lead to evolutionary advantages that neither species could achieve alone. Perhaps we should test that theory, SciFi suggested. His friends had moved closer, forming a loose circle around Katie's workstation. See if the famous human survival instincts actually exist, or if they're just myths created by a species that wants to seem more dangerous than it really is. Professor Ripton was on the other side of the laboratory, helping a group of students with their specimen preparation. The other students in their immediate area had noticed the confrontation but seemed unsure whether to intervene or simply avoid getting involved. Katie looked up from her microscope for the first time since SciFi had started talking. She made direct eye contact with him, her green eyes calm and steady. I need to finish this analysis, she said quietly. Please move so I can access the chemical testing equipment. The simple, polite request seemed to infuriate SciFi more than any argument could have. His crystal structure flared with bright, aggressive colors, and the musical tones his body produced shifted to discordant frequencies that made several nearby students wince. Please, he repeated mockingly. How civilized, how perfectly controlled. But we both know what you really want to do, don't we, human? We both know what your species does when it feels cornered. The next morning brought comparative physiology, Katie's least favorite class because it always seemed to turn into discussions about species differences and evolutionary advantages. Professor Clixandra, an ancient Kaleri with skin that had permanently settled into wise purple hues, taught the subject with enthusiasm that Katie normally would have appreciated. Today, however, she dreaded what the lesson might bring. Katie entered the lecture hall early and chose her usual seat in the back corner. The room was designed like an amphitheater, with curved rows of seats descending toward the professor's Platform. Large holographic displays could project three-dimensional models of different species' anatomical structures for detailed study. She pulled out her notebook and tablet, organizing her materials while other students filed into the room. The past few days had been increasingly difficult as Zixtela's harassment became more persistent and creative. Yesterday he had somehow arranged for her lab samples to be contaminated, forcing her to restart an entire day's worth of work. When she had reported the incident to Professor Ripton, there had been no evidence of deliberate sabotage. Splishka entered the room and immediately looked for Katie, his skin showing friendly blue-green colors. He had become her closest ally on the station, often sitting with her during meals and study sessions. Unfortunately, this friendship was making him a target as well. Katie had noticed other Zephyrian students making hostile gestures toward the Kaleri when they thought she wasn't looking. "Good morning, Katie," Splishka said as he settled into the seat beside her. "I heard today's lesson will cover stress response systems in different species. That should be interesting given your background." Katie nodded but felt a familiar knot of worry in her stomach. Lessons about stress responses and survival mechanisms always led to discussions about Deathworld adaptations, which inevitably focused attention on human biology. She would have preferred to avoid being the center of attention, but Professor Klixandra seemed to enjoy using her presence as a teaching opportunity. Zixtela and his group entered the room together, their crystal structures creating a light show of reflected illumination as they moved. Instead of taking their usual seats in the middle section, they positioned themselves in the row directly behind Katie and Splishka. She could feel their presence like cold wind on her back. "How convenient," Zixtela said in a voice just loud enough for Katie to hear. "The Deathworld specimen sits right where we can observe her reactions during today's lesson." One of his friends made a sound that passed for laughter among Zephyrians. "Perhaps we'll finally see some authentic primitive behavior when the professor discusses fight-or-flight responses." Katie opened her notebook and began reviewing her notes from the previous lesson. She had developed the ability to tune out harassment through years of practice, but something about today felt different. Zixtela's behavior was becoming more focused, more deliberately provocative. He was no longer content to simply make general comments about humans. He was targeting her specifically. Professor Klixandra began the lesson with her usual enthusiasm. "Today we will examine how different species respond to stress and perceived threats. These response systems evolved to help organisms survive dangerous situations, but they also reveal fundamental differences in how species approach problems." The professor activated the holographic display, showing a three-dimensional model of a generic humanoid nervous system. Most species have developed some form of threat assessment and response mechanism. The complexity and intensity of these systems often correlate with the danger level of their evolutionary environment. Katie tried to focus on taking notes, but she could feel Zixtela leaning forward in the seat behind her. His crystalline form was so close that she could hear the soft musical tones his body produced when he was agitated or excited. "Now let us consider species that evolved in extremely hostile environments," Professor Klixandra continued. "These so-called Deathworld species often developed enhanced response systems that allow them to function effectively under severe stress. Katie, as our resident human, perhaps you could share some insights about how these systems manifest in your species." Katie felt every eye in the room turned toward her. This was exactly what she had been hoping to avoid. Human stress responses include increased heart rate, enhanced sensory awareness, and improved reaction times, she said simply. "The purpose is to maximize survival chances during dangerous situations." But surely there's more to it than that," Professor Klixandra pressed. "Human beings are known for their ability to continue fighting even when severely injured. This suggests a much more complex system than simple alertness enhancement." Zixtela chose this moment to make his move. "Yes, tell us about the human." "Berserker rage," he said loudly enough for the entire class to hear. "I've read that humans can enter a state where they become completely irrational and attack anything nearby without regard for their own safety." Katie turned slightly in her seat to look at him. That's not accurate, she replied calmly. Human stress responses are designed to improve decision-making and physical performance, not eliminate rational thought. Really? SeatHFY's crystal structure brightened with satisfaction. Then explain the historical records of human soldiers, continuing to fight with fatal wounds or humans lifting objects many times their normal strength capacity during emergencies. Those don't sound like rational responses to me. Professor Clixandra looked interested in the discussion. That's an excellent question, SeatHFY. Katie, how would you explain these seemingly superhuman feats? Katie felt trapped. Answering. The question would require explaining human capabilities that most aliens found frightening, but refusing to answer would make her look evasive or dishonest. Extreme stress can trigger the release of chemicals that temporarily override normal safety limitations, she said carefully. It's a survival mechanism that allows access to strength and endurance reserves that are normally held back to prevent injury. So humans do have hidden reserves of dangerous capability, another Zephyrian student said. They just choose when to reveal their true nature. It's not about choosing to be dangerous, Katie replied. It's about biological systems that help ensure survival. Every species has similar mechanisms. SeatHFY leaned even closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she and Splishka could hear. But other species don't have the same reputation for violence, do they? Other species don't come from worlds where everything is trying to kill them every moment of every day. Katie tried to return her attention to Professor Clixandra, who was now displaying comparative models of stress response systems from different species. But SeatHFY wasn't finished with his private harassment. I've been wondering, he whispered, what it would take to trigger those responses in you. How much pressure would be required to make the civilized mask slip away and reveal the savage? Underneath, Splishka's skin colors shifted to angry orange. Stop bothering her, he said in a low voice. She's trying to learn just like everyone else. The amphibian speaks, SeatHFY said with amusement. How protective you've become of your Deathworld friend. Tell me, do you really think she cares about you, or are you just useful to her as a source of social acceptance? Katie's pencil snapped in her grip. The sharp crack drew looks from several nearby students, but she quickly picked up another pencil and continued taking notes as if nothing had happened. She couldn't let SeatHFY see that his words were getting to her. Interesting, SeatHFY observed. A stress response. Your grip strength just increased involuntarily, didn't it? Perhaps we're beginning to see the real Katie emerge. Professor Clixandra was discussing the evolutionary advantages of different response systems, using examples from various species' homeworlds. Katie tried to focus on the lesson, but SeatHFY's whispered commentary continued relentlessly. You know what I think? He said. I think you're afraid to show us what you really are because you know we'd reject you completely. Right now, some of the students still believe you might be different from other humans. But if they saw your true nature, they'd understand why civilized species avoid death worlds. Katie's hand tightened on her pencil, but she managed to maintain control. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her lose her composure. She had dealt with prejudice and harassment before, and she could handle it again. Perhaps we should conduct an experiment, SeatHFY suggested. See how much provocation it takes to make a human revert to its natural state? For scientific purposes? Of course. Splishka turned around in his seat to face the Zephyrian. That's enough, he said firmly. Leave her alone. Or what? SeatHFY asked. Will the amphibian defend his pet human? How amusing. I wonder if she'd protect you when things become unpleasant, or if she abandon you the moment it becomes inconvenient. Katie could feel her heart rate increasing despite her efforts to remain calm. SeatHFY was no longer content to harass her. Now he was threatening Splishka as well. The Kaleri student had been nothing but kind to her, and he didn't deserve to become a target because of their friendship. Actually, SeatHFY continued, perhaps the amphibian would make a better test subject. The following morning's advanced xenobiology class found Katie in her usual back corner seat, but today felt different from the moment she entered the lecture hall. Zixtala and his group had arrived early and positioned themselves strategically around the room. Instead of sitting together as they normally did, they had spread out to surround her position from multiple angles. Professor Veltara began her lesson on symbiotic relationships in extreme environments, but Katie found it difficult to concentrate with Zixtala's crystalline form directly beside her row. He had chosen a seat that allowed him to lean over and speak to her without the professor noticing. While his friends maintained their positions to block any easy escape routes, Katie opened her textbook and began taking notes, determined to focus on the lesson despite the obvious setup. She had spent most of the night thinking about Zixtala's threats toward Splishka, and she had come to an uncomfortable conclusion. Her strategy of complete avoidance was no longer working. If anything, it was encouraging him to escalate his behavior until he got the reaction he wanted. "Good morning, my Deathworld friend," Zixtala whispered as Professor Veltara activated the holographic displays. "I hope you slept well. Today promises to be very educational." Katie continued reading her textbook, highlighting relevant passages about organism adaptation strategies. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was studying cooperation between species, while dealing with a situation that seemed headed toward inevitable conflict. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Zixtala continued, his voice just loud enough for nearby students to hear, "about stress responses and hidden capabilities. I realize that we haven't properly tested your limits yet." Splishka entered the classroom and immediately noticed the changed seating arrangement. His skin shifted to worried orange colors as he recognized the tactical positioning of the Zephyrian students. He made his way to his usual seat beside Katie, but had to squeeze past two of Zixtala's friends who were blocking the aisle. "Ah, the amphibian joins us," Zixtala said with satisfaction. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing the nature of interspecies relationships and how they develop under pressure." Professor Veltara called for attention and began explaining the day's topic. "Today we will examine how different species form cooperative bonds when faced with shared environmental challenges. These relationships often develop remarkable levels of interdependence and mutual protection." Katie tried to focus on the professor's words, but Zixtala had other plans. He reached across the gap between their seats and placed his sharp crystalline hand directly on top of her open textbook, covering the page she was trying to read. "Pay attention to me when I'm speaking to you," he said quietly. "It's rude to ignore someone who's trying to have a conversation." For the first time in weeks, Katie looked directly at Zixtala. Her green eyes were calm and steady, showing no sign of the anger or fear he was obviously hoping to provoke. "I'm trying to study," she said simply. "Please remove your hand from my book." "Such politeness," Zixtala replied, but he didn't move. His hand, such careful control. "Tell me, how long can you maintain this facade before your true nature emerges?" Splishka's colors deepened to angry red. "She asked you politely to move your hand, show some respect." "Respect?" Zixtala's crystal structure flared brighter. "For a species that has never learned the meaning of the word? Humans take what they want through violence and call it survival. They destroy everything they touch and call it progress." Katie placed her hands flat on the desk and took a slow, deep breath. She could feel her heart rate increasing despite her efforts to remain calm. Around the room, other students had noticed the confrontation and were watching with obvious interest and concern. "Look at her," one of Zixtala's friends called out from across the room. "See how she grips the desk?" The primitive stress responses are already beginning to manifest. Professor Veltara paused her lecture and looked toward the disturbance. "Is there a problem, students? Perhaps you have questions about the symbiotic relationships we're discussing." "Actually, yes," Zixtala said, raising his voice so the entire class could hear. "I was wondering about parasitic relationships disguised as cooperation. How do we identify when one species is simply using another for its own benefit?" The professor's ancient crystal structure showed patterns of confusion and concern. "That's an interesting question, but perhaps we could discuss it after the lecture. For now, please allow me to continue with today's lesson." "Of course, Professor," Zixtala replied with exaggerated courtesy. But instead of returning his attention to the front of the room, he leaned even closer to Katie. "You're very good at pretending to be civilized," he whispered. "But we both know what you really are underneath all that careful control." Katie tried to turn the page of her textbook, but SciFi's hand remained pressed firmly against the paper. She could feel the sharp edges of his crystalline fingers through the thin material, and she realized he was gradually increasing the pressure. "Remove your hand," she said again, her voice still calm but carrying a note of warning that made several nearby students glance in her direction. "Make me," SciFi challenged. "Show everyone in this room what a Deathworld human does when someone doesn't obey their polite requests." Splishka stood up from his seat, his skin now showing deep red patterns of anger and alarm. "Professor Veltara," he called out. "SciFi is disrupting Katie's ability to participate in the lesson." The elderly professor looked more carefully at their section of the room. "SciFi, please return to your proper seat and allow your classmates to focus on their studies." "I am studying, Professor," SciFi replied. "I'm conducting a behavioral analysis of Deathworld species under stress conditions." "Very educational." Katie felt something inside her chest begin to tighten. Not anger exactly, but a cold, focused awareness that she recognized from her father's descriptions of human combat. Psychology. Her vision seemed to sharpen, and she became acutely aware of every detail of her surroundings, the exact position of each student, the distance to the exits, the potential weapons available in the laboratory equipment scattered around the room. "Fascinating," SciFi observed. "Your pupils are dilating and your breathing has changed rhythm. The famous human stress response is finally beginning to activate." Katie closed her eyes for a moment and forced herself to relax. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. But when she opened her eyes again, SciFi was no longer looking at her. He was staring directly at Splishka with an expression that made her blood run cold. "Perhaps the amphibian needs to learn about the dangers of associating with violent species," SciFi said. He stood up from his seat and moved toward Splishka, his crystalline form casting sharp reflections in the laboratory lighting. "Sit down, SciFi," Professor Veltara commanded, but her voice carried more confusion than authority. The elderly Zephyrian had spent her life studying peaceful scientific cooperation between species, and she seemed unprepared to deal with deliberate aggression in her classroom, ignored the professor's command and positioned himself directly in front of Splishka. "Tell me, amphibian, what do you think your human friend will do if I hurt you? Will she finally show us her true nature, or will she abandon you to save herself?" Splishka's skin colors shifted rapidly between fear, anger, and determination. "Katie has never shown anything but kindness and intelligence," he said firmly. "Your prejudice blinds you to what she really is." "Then let's find out what she really is," SciFi replied. He reached out with one sharp crystalline hand toward Splishka's neck. Katie had endured weeks of harassment, insults, and provocations without responding. She had ignored threats, put up with sabotage, and maintained perfect self-control in the face of deliberate cruelty. But watching SciFi reach toward her friend with obvious intent to cause harm triggered something deep in her biology that no amount of civilized behavior could suppress. She sighed quietly, a sound that somehow carried more menace than any shout of anger could have produced. With deliberate care, she closed her textbook and placed it neatly in front of her. Then, without standing up from her seat, without raising her voice, and while maintaining steady eye contact with SciFi, Katie reached up with her right hand and grasped the Zephyrian by the base of his crystalline neck structure. The entire lecture hall fell into absolute silence. Katie's grip was precise and controlled, her fingers finding the exact pressure points that would disrupt SciFi's nervous system without causing permanent damage. The Zephyrian's intimidating posture crumbled instantly as his body's control systems struggled to function under the human girl's expert hold. "Please step away from my friend," Katie said in the same calm, polite tone she had used throughout weeks of harassment. "I asked unanimously." With a soft crystalline crack that echoed through the silent room, something in SciFi's neck structure gave way under the carefully applied pressure. He collapsed immediately, his bioluminescent glow flickering erratically as his nervous system fought to maintain basic functions. He wasn't dead or permanently injured, but he would require significant medical attention and regeneration therapy.